I remember you talked to Protestant on some live stream a while back, and you argued over tradition, and he said, "How do you justify?"
By the way, it is soterikos. I'm correct. Go ahead.
Yeah, you argued about he, as a Protestant, he obviously believed in sola scriptura, and he said, "How do you trust tradition?" And you said, "You also trust tradition because you trust the scriptures." And he didn't get your point, so you started arguing over that. But the question he asked you about, how can a person discern what church history is true? Because obviously I can't understand the Bible perfectly, like sola scriptura and all is false. How can I discern that what church history are the Catholics correct?
Yeah,
or the Orthodox correct?
I understand. So this is misunderstanding what we're trying to argue with the notion of tradition and normativity. The argument is not if you believe in tradition, you're going to get epistemic certitude. That's not what the argument is. It's two different arguments. So first of all, when it comes to Protestants, Catholics, and Orthodox, we are all, even in their own systems, we are admitted to all be in the same boat. We're all going to be relying on, at the end of the day, for individual certitude, the work of the Holy Spirit, right? And each of these systems, by the way, admits this. For the Protestant, it's at the end of the day, it's the Holy Spirit guiding you and reading the scriptures. For the Roman Catholic, at the end of the day, it's the Holy Spirit guiding you in the magisterium and the papal teaching. For the Orthodox, it's the Holy Spirit guiding you at the end of the day to read the councils, the church fathers, the Bible, etc. But where we differ is the means that the Holy Spirit uses to give us that knowledge. For the Orthodox, it's a combination of the liturgy, the lives of the saints, the Bible, the church fathers, etc. All those things kind of work together. For the Roman Catholic, it's the papal magisterium. And for the Protestant, it's again just the Holy Spirit guiding the believer to interpret the Bible correctly. That's a different question from the notion of normative authority and normativity. That's the ability, that has to do with oughts, right? So that's the question of, is there any body of men in history that has the authority to bind people's consciences to some interpretation? So they're two different issues. Individual certitude is not equivalent to the question of normative authority. So, and they might be related, right? Because you're in a better position, for example, if you're Protestant, or excuse me, if you're Orthodox or Roman Catholic versus a Protestant when it comes to, well, at least both of those groups believe that there's some body of people who can make binding decisions, right? Because we have an ecclesiology that says that the bishops have the authority to excommunicate people. They have normative authority to say you have to follow the teachings of Nicaea or you're excommunicated with Arius, right? So that's normative authority. It's not the same thing as certitude. So every time Roman Catholics come to this debate with Protestants and they muddy the waters with, you can't have certainty without the papacy. They're just confusing those two issues.
And that makes sense. And I've always, it's being a Protestant, it's hard trying to justify or relying on myself rather than the church fathers or the history, because it always comes down to my own interpretations, which I do not trust very heavily.
Well, that's fair. I mean, that's true at a basic level to say, is it really just me and the Bible? But I mean, you're not going to escape the epistemic dilemma of, well, you as an individual are going to have to interpret the papal documents, and you're going to have to interpret, the Roman Catholic Catechism, and you're going to have to interpret, the magisterium's documents, etc. Like, you're not going to get away from that point, right? Of, are you interpreting the documents correctly, right?
But
That's unavoidable. Everybody's in that boat. But that's different than the Protestant doctrine of the right of private interpretation, which relates directly to this issue of normativity. Is there any body of people that has the authority to bind a person or a group of people or the church to their interpretation? You see how they're two different issues? One of them is my own individual existential epistemic certitude. Do I know if I'm interpreting this book right? Do I know if I'm interpreting this catechism right? Right. That's inescapable. Everybody is in that boat. Like, you can't get out of that by just saying, oh, well, I have the Pope, right? That's just moving the problem back a step, because now the question is, Well, are you interpreting what the Pope says right? And I'm not being like obtuse in this, because in the Roman Catholic world, this happens all the time. Roman Catholics constantly debate what the Pope meant, what Vatican II meant. So just having a magisterium that churns out more documents and more interpretations of the interpretation of the interpretation. And in the Roman Catholic world, by the way, it gets so absurd that you have literally people going to the fallible interpretation of the infallible councils and the popes. That's how silly this is. And so it's just this infinite circle and cycle of regress of, well, we need an infallible statement from the Pope on this doctrine. And then when that comes out, it's ambiguous. And so people then say, well, that's why you got to read Father so-and-so's lectures on the meaning of Vatican II and how it's in continuity. Well, I thought Vatican II was the magisterium, which is supposed to solve the issues. But now I got to go to the infallible interpretation. I mean, the fallible. How do I know that I'm reading Father so-and-so's reading of Vatican II right? How do we know that he got it right? You see how it's just an infinite regress of a circle of absurdity. It's stupid.
Yeah, I agree
So it's
completely. I agree
missing the
completely.
point.
But doesn't the Orthodox Church have a bit of the same problem with the canonical texts? There are different interpretations, you know.
You're missing what I'm saying. Like I'm pointing out that there's two different things going on. One of them is the issue of individual certitude, and everyone's in the same boat. You're never going to get out of the question of how do you know that you're interpreting this or that document correctly. That's a separate question from normative authority, right? It's like the difference between reading the Constitution and are you accurately interpreting the Constitution versus is there a Supreme Court that has authority to interpret the Constitution? They're two different questions. See?
Yeah, I see. Yes, but how do you?
So the answer to your question is no. An Orthodox person doesn't escape the dilemma of are they interpreting the documents correctly? Nobody does. Everybody has this problem. And just having another layer or level of documents doesn't solve the issue. Even if you say that layer is infallible. It's like, okay, well, so I've got to if you get the documents of Vatican II, right? It's like 800 pages. So you're telling me that in order to understand and interpret Vatican I correctly, and I'm saying that because a lot of Roman Catholics will argue that Vatican II is supposedly the part two to Vatican I. Again, that's debatable, but many of them argue this. So let's say that that's true. So I need another 800 pages to interpret the, I don't know, 15 pages of Vatican I. Doesn't it seem to follow then that I'm going to need another 1,600 pages to interpret the 800 pages of Vatican II? I mean, when are we going to get Vatican III that explains Vatican II? It's just stupid. It's like it's at an epistemic level. It's just silly. It's like it's stuff that you would encounter in like epistemology 101 class, like infinite regress problems.
Yeah,
So the difference is that the Orthodox person, any individual Orthodox, is in the same boat as an individual Protestant. So the question is, well, what's the big difference? Well, the difference is the means that the Holy Spirit uses to give us that knowledge. If I'm Orthodox, the means are different. I believe in the councils. I believe in the church fathers. I believe in, the catechisms of the Orthodox Church. I believe in the liturgy. All of those things, the Bible. All those things are necessary components of as to where I derive divine revelation from. And no, you can never get away from, as an individual, having to try to interpret those things.
dang, I was
But
hoping I
that's
could.
different from no, nobody's gonna. How are you gonna get away? How are you gonna get away from that? Like I think a lot of people think that the papal option is like, oh, here's an easy answer. I can shut off my brain and I just follow whatever the Pope says. Well, but you still have to interpret 800 pages of what the Pope said at Vatican II. So anyway, great questions. I appreciate that.